Welcome to our first session of Here's the Church, Here's the Steeple. Over the coming weeks, we're going to look at just general idea of sacred space and how churches, architecturally speaking, have evolved and sort of what I call the geography, in other words, the different parts of the church, of the physical plant. Then we're also going to look at the vessels and furniture and vestments and actions that happen in the coming weeks after that. And then in our fourth and final week, we're going to actually do a sort of video or at least picture tour of St. James, applying all of these concepts and these ideas and apply them specifically to our church here at St. James, especially in light of our recent renovation and restoration. Now, before we get too far, I want us to start by just looking and sort of reflecting on the use of sacred space in general within not just Christian church and the Christian faith, but also in the history of humanity. You know, one of the things we see early on is for instance, in Genesis 8, right there in that section that's often called the primordial history, that history that is universal, not just on sort of God's chosen people through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but rather that sort of big picture of stories, understanding how things came to be the way they are. We'd already seen sacrifices with Cain and Abel, but here we specifically see after Noah and his family have come out of the ark, the first thing they do is set aside a sacred space. And in fact, it says in Genesis 8, and every animal, every creeping thing, and every bird, everything that moves on the earth went out of the ark by families. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord and took every clean animal and every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. Now, we have to just clarify, that there are two sort of storylines telling the story of the Noah story, in particular, that we see. But really, in a lot of Genesis, we have several voices that come into play. And in this case, you might be going, wait a minute, if Noah does that, if you're trying to reconcile a literal translation, which would not be my approach per se, but it's that Noah is told to take 7 pairs of every clean animal and 1 pair of unclean. And so anyway, that's how we could get to that understanding then of one of every clean animal is offered up in sacrifice. And we see that specifically it talks of not just offering a sacrifice, but Noah goes out of his way to build an altar, to build a sacred space, and to set it aside in thanksgiving to the Lord. And then we see this happen more and more. We see this in the story of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. All of them set aside different sacred spaces at different times, typically after an encounter with the holy. And in fact, oftentimes that these are places and locations that will come to have significance and prominence in the life of the Israelites in the long term, and then marked, though, and set aside as holy. So much so that we even see, for instance, Jesus having an encounter at Jacob's well, that same Jacob that goes all the way back to Genesis. And we see after Jacob wrestles with the angel, he sets aside, he names that space and sets it aside as a holy space where he had encountered the holy itself. Not only that, but we see then, even as we move into the Israelites, as they're wandering through the wilderness, when they are feeling distant, and as Moses had been gone for so long, what do? The Israelites make a golden calf, and it highlights that human tendency and that sort of innate psychological need for the physical. We ourselves are physical beings, and that we are drawn to the physical world around us as well. And so the golden calf becomes a symbol of that in many ways. And so that when Moses does receive the 10 Commandments and has all these other holy items that go into the Ark of the Covenant, that it then travels around with the tabernacle tent and has set aside as a holy space. And so Moses is given instructions that he then shares with the Israelites on how to set aside that holy space. That then leads to David wanting to build the temple. and setting it in this new city that he has set up out of the ashes of an old city of Jerusalem. And he wants to build a temple. He's told that he can't. So what does he do? He collects all the items and things that are needed for it. And then that task is given to his son, Solomon, who builds the first temple. And then once it's destroyed and they're allowed to return, they quickly build a second temple because of that draw to a holy, sacred space. If we continue to look at this sort of as we reflect on these different stories, we have then even Jesus. And one of the stories of his early life is to go to the temple, and his parents leave and he is left behind. And he even says, "Where else would I have been but in my Father's house?" And so we see, even as that continues to play out, that holy spaces, set aside sacred spaces, are important to our relationship and how we relate. Not that God needs those sacred spaces, but that we need those sacred spaces. And so again, we even see that in every major world religious tradition, and the major ones, the biggest, whether it's Christianity, Islam, the Jewish faith, Buddhists, Hindus, all of them have some sort of, whether it's a church, synagogue, mosque, or temple, they have some sort of space. And even here in America, the Native Americans had a sense of the sacred and holy within its land and within specific landmarks that were believed to be these channels between them and the spirit world. And so all this is to say that I can't speak for every religion, but many and most religions have this understanding of the importance of space within the practice of faith. And that even non-religious individuals, I've heard this just anecdotally, time and time again, will say or call some certain space, usually something with nature due to the natural beauty or whatever, that they'll call it holy or that they'll call it spiritual. And so a church historian from the University of Chicago by the name of Jonathan Smith suggested that sacred space is a, quote, focusing lens for our attention on the forms, objects, and actions, and reveals these items as bearers of meaning. So in other words, so he calls them focusing lenses. And in other words, these sacred spaces are defined by the function that it helps to serve and the purpose and meaning that it highlights. That they by themselves are not necessarily sacred, but it's what they help to point to and to focus our attention as a focusing lens of our faith as lived out. And so what does the liturgical space tell us about our worship and our understanding of the nature of God? See, that's a big question that as we see the evolution of then specifically church architecture, that it's important to ask and to say, what is this telling us about God and our relationship with God and our understanding of God and about our worship itself? Well, the early church began meeting in homes, often very simple gatherings, many times around just a regular table in the home, and it was then revolved around even a meal at times. And that this over time sort of evolved to include not just church and home, but even specific buildings or rooms set aside for this purpose, or they would even go as sort of an ultimate laughing in the face of death because of the hope we have in the resurrection. They would go to the catacombs to worship from time to time, to be in this perceived land of the dead, knowing that it is just the precursor to eternal life. And so these were powerful sort of symbols, but it was more informal and smaller. But then as Christianity is legalized, they begin to really dedicate more and more specific buildings to the purpose of church as a means to share, and now that they are open, to share who we are and to invite people in. And some of those early churches are in a sort of a form called a basilica. Now, a basilica was just any sort of public gathering meeting place within the Roman Empire. And it was typically fairly long, rectangular in shape with sort of a curved bottom or a curved roof, sorry, and would be a place where people would gather in the middle, and sort of sides were how on around the sides were how people moved, and that therefore became sort of the architectural form, the sort of classical architecture form with columns down the sides, as well as how the church began its gathering using this architectural building of a basilica. And so that's even then where we get into the understanding of a nave that we're going to talk about a little bit, is that sort of curved ceiling, oftentimes with a little point jutting up, that then was where windows would be to allow light to come in. And then as time came on, so this was just the utilize of a, area and a space that was already involved, and gathered the people all as one in the middle, which carries its own theological meaning, and within a separate sacred space at the front where the Eucharist could occur. But then as we go out of the Roman Empire and we move more into the rural, to smaller churches, but starting to go into also, though, the large cathedral type churches and these big churches. And what we start to see is, for instance, the Gothic cruciform. We start to see these churches being built in the shape of a cross, as a symbol of our faith, as is imprinted on the very people gathered together. And we live most fully and more fully into Gothic architecture, which is marked by how ornate it was. To be that ornate decoration was meant to help us see the beauty of God through the beauty of creation, and to have a transcending effect, bringing our eyes to look skyward and to be in awe of the space around us, to then remind us how much bigger and grander God is. They typically had a stone altar that was very large. There was very tall ceilings to create that transcending effect. There was lots of stained glass windows to increase the lighting and to teach stories to a population that was mostly illiterate and unable to read. And then, as I said, it was very ornate. There was a lot of bling a lot of times, whether it was through gold or brass, or even through mosaics and other frescoes and paintings and things like that. And so the Gothic church, we a lot of times think of, is when we think of Gothic, we think of dark and things like that. But the actual intent was to be airy compared to other architecture of the time, and to let in as much light, natural light, as possible, creating this transcendent effect. And then the Gothic architecture is going to come back into style during the 19th century. And that's what our church is part of the Gothic revival. Then we also have sort of the post-Reformation and colonial period. It kind of taps back into that earlier basilica idea, with all the people in the middle a lot of times. Not always, but a lot of times. It loses the lot of that over-ornate and use of stained glass, and goes with more simplified. And oftentimes places the pulpit in a very prominent location where the attention is almost completely on the pulpit, thus giving a theology of the importance of the taught word, specifically, especially to the people in their language, and that emphasis is put on then the readings from the Bible, and then unpacking the significance of those stories. It was often influenced, as I said, by that classical architecture. It was often box-shaped, but more rectangular, but still boxy. And it was very prominent pulpit, and then it was limited stained glass windows. That's not to say they didn't have color in their windows, but they did not make shapes or forms or things like that. It was just very much more simplified, and about the gathering itself and the words spoken, and not just the beauty of the space and how that transcends and creates message also. The next thing that we started to see when we then came into the 20th century was an evolution back to the idea of that sort of post-Reformation colonial basilica, but doing it in a way that created a sense of community. And so we even started to see, for instance, churches in the round by the time we get to the mid to late 20th century, with the idea that people were either in a half circle or even a full circle around the altar, and everything was equally prominent as far as the altar, the pulpit, and the baptismal font. And with the idea being that everyone, it's holding all three of these in balance, and that there's no bad seat in the house, so to speak, that it's everyone is close, and it creates a sense of community. And so less of a transcendent view of God and more of a relational view of God, as we are given very easy access, visual access to what is happening in the liturgy. And then the last thing I'll say is that also came out of the Reformation was that on sort of more extreme Protestant side of things, it was this idea that the churches themselves should mirror completely whatever the current understanding of the public sphere would be. Almost like that idea of the Basilica that I mentioned earlier. But the way that that got manifested is that you would often see them and they would look like a theater. Whatever year they were built in, is that they would mirror whether it's the acting theater or even a movie theater in some ways in more recent times. But that whatever a sort of nice theater would look like in the time that it was built, that's then what the church would mirror in its appearance, with just a few things that would maybe illustrate and highlight that it's a church and not just simply a theater. So, for instance, a very large church in Houston, where I grew up, is Second Baptist, and it looks like a theater with almost a stage, big area where the choir sits behind that sort of stage to present the music, very little congregational singing. There's no cross, there's nothing like that, and even the stained glass window that they have is then kind of more of an artistic addition meant to symbolize it as a church, but to not have images, not have specific images and things like that, to just kind of differentiate it as a church, but yet still in that theater sort of architectural model. And again, all of that then is putting its focus on the fact that the liturgy itself is meant to be engaged, but is to be witnessed. You're there to hear beautiful music, and you're there to hear a sermon, and oftentimes, especially in, like, for instance, a Baptist tradition, a comparative to an Episcopal church service, a very long sermon as compared one to the other. But that's sort of then the idea. So now what we're going to do, though, is we're going to orient ourselves within the church building. This is what I call the church geography. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to take a moment to just look at the different parts of the church and then where that idea and that concept comes from. And so the first thing we're going to do is look at the narthex. The narthex is what's called the west end of the church. Now, the first thing we have to realize is that whether a church faces true east or not, that the altar wall is on the east side of the church or not, we always call that the east. That is the liturgical east. Now, it just so happens in our church, it's pretty dead on close to true east. However, that is the idea, though, is that that's rooted in this concept and this idea that Christ would be returning with the rising of the sun, and that we would be on the lookout for his return. And so the congregation and everyone faces towards the east, and that's then the wall that the altar itself was then put on. And so the narthex, though, is therefore on the west end of the church. And this is the entrance or the porch. And it literally comes from a word meaning the small case. So in other words, it's the small little case or space or porch, entrance, whatever you want to call it, that you transition from the outside world into this holy, set-aside, sacred space. Now, historically, this was also the place where those who were not eligible for admittance into the church were to stop. In other words, there was a long period within church history that if you were unbaptized, you were not allowed into the nave, which we're going to talk about next. If you were a catechumen, as it was called, or if you were a well-known sinner who was penitent and going through different acts of penitence, then that's where you would come in, and you would stop in the narthex, and you would very publicly, perhaps, do acts of repentance, whether it's to wear a hair shirt, which was meant to be extremely itchy and beyond just uncomfortable. Perhaps it was to kneel on something that was hard or even kind of sharpish, practices that we don't do today. But this was a common practice, especially during the medieval church and even in the legalized under the Roman Empire, because that's one of the emperor who legalized Christianity was Constantine, but the one who made it the state religion came to the conclusion it needed to be the official state religion after a week of penitential actions just outside the church. After Ambrose, the Bishop of Milan, refused to grant him entrance into the church because of his notorious sins, because he murdered women and children in a very famous battle. And so anyway, so that's what the narthex also used to serve as. But it was that place where, therefore, and we'll talk about this next week, that sometimes even the baptismal font would be there as a reminder that you're to be baptized before coming in. And if you do enter, to then remember your baptism as you enter. So the next space then, as you go and transition from the outside world into the church, through the narthex, you enter into the nave. The nave is that section in which the people are seated. It is that central part of the church. And in the cruciform, it's the long arm of the cross. And as I said, it usually, at one point in the Basilica model and in some of the other models, it was side aisles, more traditionally, or for longer periods. We've seen it with a center aisle with maybe side aisles. But nonetheless, we see this sort of forming of the cross. But the nave itself gets its name from navis, or ship, and it is used or based off of the old Roman basilicas, where those roofs were mostly rounded except for the little point at the top that allowed for like a jutting up of windows to allow light in. And what we have is that it looked like a ship that was, or the bottom of the ship. So the ceiling looked like the bottom of a ship. And the idea is that in the early church, especially as the ichthys, the fish, became the symbol before the cross even of Christianity, and this thought and reminder that Jesus called us through Peter and Andrew and James and John and their callings to be apostles, but we are called to be fishers of men, or fishers of people. And then we also have the stories of Jesus where he calms the sea from the boat. Or we even have then Noah, in which the chaotic waters, the destructive waters of the world around come crashing in, but the ark protects Noah and his family and the animals in order to bring salvation and restoration. And so the idea was that a boat became the symbol of the church, not just the building, but of the body of Christ, but then represented through its building with the ceiling looking like the bottom of a boat, that we here are traveling this way through the chaotic waters of the world and of life, but that yet God, through Christ, his plan of salvation and grace emerges, that the crazy chaotic waters are brought to be calmed. So the next thing then that we have is back to just the space in general is the transept. Now the transepts are part of what's called the crossing, and this isn't the crossing isn't marked on your sort of church map on the slide. But the crossing is what connects the four arms of the cross, and the transepts are then an extension of that, and those are the sides of the arms of the cruciform, and they are on the liturgical north and south. And the transept literally translates to mean across the fence or partition. And so, in other words, on the other side, especially in some of those early churches, on the other side of the columns and perhaps support walls that were needed. And it's in some churches like ours, this is where we have seats for people to be able to sit. In other churches, sometimes the transepts even contain chapels or other things like that. Little side chapels where other smaller services can either happen separately or even concurrently with the larger service. And so that's where the transepts are. And then the crossing is that between that space between the nave and then our next section, which is the chancel, or even often sometimes called the choir. Because technically the chancel is everything from the crossing to the east wall. But more often than not, what we mean by chancel is the choir area. And that is that area where there's the celebrant desk as well as the preacher's desk in our church, which is right there at the front of the steps. It's the pulpit, it's the lectern, it's the pews in which the choir sits, and it is the organ and all of that space. Now, not listed on your map, but right off of the chancel and choir area is typically the sacristy, which is where the altar guild or those serving at the altar are able to do the things they need to do in preparation and following, such as cleaning and all those other things that need to be done and prepared for in order to make sure a service happens. So anyway, that is the chancel. It is that space on the other side of the nave and crossing, and it is used by the clergy and the choir for the leading of the service, especially the liturgy of the word portion. So then inside, technically again, inside the chancel, but oftentimes designated as its own space, is the sanctuary and apse. Now, the sanctuary comes actually from a word that is used to describe in King Solomon's temple that area, that space in which contained the Holy of Holies. It was the most sacred holy space. Very few people were limited, and that is the idea, is that it is that holy space. That's truly sacred space. And so we have that designated as inside the altar rail. Inside the altar rail, where the altar is located, and so is the ambry, and we'll talk about that next week. But it's that sort of sacred space that is designated and set aside for this purpose of holy actions. See, not only is it the space that we even do communion, but it's also, for instance, when a bride and groom come forward to exchange vows in a wedding. They come to the steps of the sanctuary. They don't enter into it, but they come to the steps of the sanctuary to be the place where they exchange their vows. So it's that holy, sacred spot. And it comes from the holy room or space. Literally, sanctuary broken out just means holy space, holy room. And as far as the apse go, the apse is a sort of semicircular, sometimes a space behind the altar. Sometimes it's just right there, includes the altar. But it's an architectural design, usually in Gothic churches, especially cathedrals, that's sort of a semi-dome, half dome, right there at the eastern end of the church. So that gives us a little bit of a sort of orienting ourselves, the history of sacred space and the importance of sacred space, looking at how church architecture has evolved, going back and forth between concepts, and how architecture itself and the placement of items gives us an idea of and our understanding, a theological insight, if you will, of who we are and who God is and what the relationship between the two is and is supposed to look like, especially within the worshiping life of the congregation. And then, as we said just now, we've kind of oriented ourselves, just generally speaking, on the areas or parts of the church, so that next week we can dive into the furnishings of the church and to better understand where things are within this sort of church geography. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next week.